The scream of a horse in pain tore through the misty morning air, and Eleanor Hartley dropped the basket of eggs she was carrying and ran toward the sound without a single thought for her own safety. She found the animal thrashing near the old fence line that separated her family's small cottage from the vast forested edge of a neighboring estate. Its leg was caught between two broken rails, and with every panicked movement, the wood dug deeper into its flesh. Blood streaked down the horse's front leg, dark and glistening against its pale coat. Eleanor did not hesitate. She had grown up around animals, had nursed injured lambs and frightened dogs since she was a child, and she moved toward the horse with slow, steady steps, speaking low and calm words even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "Easy now," she whispered, reaching out a hand. "Easy. I am not here to hurt you." The horse's eyes rolled wildly, showing white all around the edges, but something in her voice seemed to reach it. It stilled just enough for her to see what she needed to do. She pulled off her shawl and wrapped it around her hands before gripping the splintered wood and working it apart, inch by careful inch, while the horse trembled beside her. Twice it kicked out, narrowly missing her shoulder. She did not back away. By the time she freed the leg, her hands were raw and bleeding in places, her dress torn at the hem, and her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The horse stood shaking beside her, favoring its injured leg, but alive, and no longer trapped. She studied the animal properly for the first time and felt her stomach tighten with unease. This was no farm horse. Its coat was groomed to a shine beneath the dirt and blood, its build lean and powerful, bred for speed and elegance rather than labor. A fine leather bridle, torn loose from whatever had startled it, hung uselessly from its neck. Someone of considerable means owned this animal, and that someone would want to know where it was. Eleanor led the horse slowly back toward her cottage, murmuring to it the entire way, though her mind raced far ahead of her feet. Her family's circumstances were not what they once had been. Her father had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind debts that swallowed most of what they owned, and her mother's health had grown fragile in the years since. Eleanor managed the household now, stretching what little coin they had, mending what could be mended, and swallowing her pride more times than she cared to admit. She had once dreamed of a different life, filled with books and conversation, and the kind of freedom only wealth could buy. But those dreams had dulled with time, replaced by the quiet, unglamorous work of survival. She settled the horse in the small stable behind her cottage, the only structure sturdy enough to hold an animal of its size, and set to work cleaning its wound with water she had boiled over the fire. The horse flinched at first, then grew calmer as she worked, as though it understood she meant it no harm. She talked to it the entire time, the way she often talked to herself when the silence of the cottage grew too heavy. "You are a beautiful creature," she said, running a gentle hand along its neck. "Whoever lost you must be beside themselves." She thought of sending word immediately, but a practical concern stopped her. She did not know whose horse this was, and going door to door across the countryside was not an option, not with her mother needing tending and the morning chores still undone. She decided instead to finish caring for the animal, to make certain its wound was properly dressed and its fear soothed, and to send her young neighbor, a boy named Peter who ran errands for coin, to the nearest great house to ask if anyone had lost a horse. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor fed her mother a small breakfast, checked on the horse twice more, and mended a torn curtain that had been bothering her for weeks. All the while, a strange restlessness sat in her chest, as though she sensed something significant hovering just beyond the edge of her ordinary day. She told herself it was foolishness. A horse had wandered onto her land, and she had done what any decent person would do, nothing more. By midday, Peter returned, breathless from running, with news that made Eleanor's stomach drop. "The horse," he said, "belonged to the Duke of Ashcombe, whose estate bordered 3 villages and whose name was spoken with equal parts awe and unease throughout the county. He was said to be a hard man, cold in his dealings, unmarried despite his fortune, and utterly unconcerned with the opinions of those beneath his station." Eleanor had heard the stories, as everyone had, though she had never once expected to have any dealings with the man himself. "They said his stablemaster has been searching everywhere," Peter told her, still catching his breath. "The horse got spooked during a storm 2 nights past and bolted clean off the estate grounds. They feared it dead." Eleanor glanced back toward the stable, where the horse now stood calmly, its wound cleaned and wrapped, chewing contentedly on a mouthful of hay. She felt an odd pang of protectiveness, foolish as it was. She had only known the animal for a few hours, yet something about the whole ordeal had settled into her chest and refused to leave. "Did you tell them where it was?" she asked. Peter nodded. "I told the man at the gate. He said someone would come." Eleanor thanked him and pressed a small coin into his palm, more than she could afford, but more than the errand deserved for the speed with which he'd run it. She returned to the stable and sat on an overturned crate near the horse, watching it eat, her thoughts drifting toward the man who owned it. She pictured someone cold and distant, the way the villagers described him, someone who would likely send a servant to collect his property without so much as a word of thanks. She told herself she did not care either way. She had done what needed doing, and soon enough this strange interruption to her ordinary life would end, and she would return to her chores and her worries, and the quiet rhythm of her days. But the afternoon wore on, and no one came. Eleanor busied herself with the wash, hanging linens on the line behind the cottage, glancing now and then toward the road that wound past her home. She told herself she was not watching for anyone, that her glances were simple curiosity and nothing more. But each time the wind stirred the trees, her pulse quickened just slightly, and she hated herself a little for it. Her mother, resting in her chair near the window, called out to her sometime past 3 in the afternoon. "Eleanor, dear, come look at this." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the window, following her mother's gaze toward the road. A rider approached at a controlled but urgent pace, mounted on a horse nearly as fine as the one now resting in their stable. Even from this distance, something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed and commanding, suggested a man unaccustomed to being kept waiting. "Do you think that's him?" her mother asked, a note of worry in her voice. "The Duke himself, come all this way?" Eleanor did not answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the approaching rider, and the strange restlessness she had felt all day sharpened into something closer to nerves. She smoothed her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and reminded herself firmly that she had nothing to be ashamed of. She had saved his horse. She had done nothing wrong. Still, as the rider drew close enough for her to make out the sharp line of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze fixed on her cottage, Eleanor felt her heart climb into her throat, and she understood, with a certainty she could not explain, that her quiet, unremarkable life had just changed in ways she was not yet prepared to face. The rider slowed his horse at the edge of her small yard and dismounted with the fluid ease of a man who had spent his entire life on horseback. He was younger than she had expected, though the stories had never mentioned his age, and there was nothing frail or distant about the way he moved toward her. His coat was fine but travel-worn, his dark hair windswept from the ride, and his eyes, a striking shade of gray, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away and stare all at once. "I am told a horse was found on this property," he said, his voice low and controlled, though she caught the faint edge of urgency beneath it. "A gray gelding, injured near the fence line." "He is here," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the stable, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the way her pulse hammered in her ears. "I dressed his wound myself. He is resting comfortably." Something shifted in the man's expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps, or something closer to relief that he seemed determined not to show. He said nothing further but moved past her toward the stable, and Eleanor found herself following, unwilling to be dismissed so easily in her own yard. The moment the horse caught sight of him, it let out a low, welcoming sound and pressed its nose against his shoulder. The man's entire demeanor softened, if only for a moment, as he ran a careful hand along the animal's neck, checking the wound Eleanor had dressed with a critical eye that quickly turned to something like grudging approval. "You did this?" he asked, glancing at her. "I did," Eleanor said. "He was tangled badly in the fence. I feared the leg was broken at first, but it is only a deep cut. He should heal well if the wound is kept clean." The man studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze as though it were something physical, pressing against her skin. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink beneath it, and something in his expression shifted again, curiosity replacing the wariness that had been there before. "Most would have simply sent word and waited for someone to collect him," he said. "Few would have taken the trouble to tend a stranger's horse themselves." "He was suffering," Eleanor said simply. "It did not matter to me whose horse he was." The man's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the sharp lines of his face. "That is a rare quality," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. And Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest at the words, though she told herself firmly it meant nothing at all. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden light across the yard, and Eleanor realized with a start that the man showed no sign of leaving any time soon. He remained beside his horse, asking careful questions about the wound, about how she had found him, about the fence itself, and how it had come to be broken. She answered each question honestly, aware the entire time of how closely he watched her, as though trying to solve some puzzle she did not know she presented. Neither of them spoke of who he was, not directly, though the truth sat unspoken between them, heavy and impossible to ignore. Eleanor knew precisely who stood in her yard, and she suspected, from the careful, measured way he held himself, that he was equally aware of exactly how far beneath his station she stood. And yet, as the sky deepened into shades of amber and rose, and the horse settled contentedly between them, Eleanor found herself unable to look away from him, unable to summon the caution she knew this moment demanded. By the time he finally turned to leave, the sun had nearly touched the horizon, and something had shifted between them that neither was quite ready to name. He returned the very next morning, arriving on a fresh horse just as Eleanor stepped outside to check on his gelding. She had not expected him again so soon, and the sight of him standing at her gate sent a flutter of nerves through her chest that she quickly forced down. "Adrian Whitmore," he said, before she could ask. "You know me by another name, I suspect, but I would rather you know me by this one." Eleanor studied him for a moment, surprised by the directness of the offer. Most men of his station guarded their names like treasure, doling out formality to keep the world at a careful distance. "Eleanor Hartley," she said, matching his plainness, "though I imagine you already know that as well." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I asked," he admitted. "I wanted to know who had shown my horse more kindness in one morning than most people show each other in a lifetime." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, and turned toward the stable to hide it, gesturing for him to follow. The gelding nickered softly at the sight of him, and Adrian moved to check the wound with the same careful attention he had shown the day before. Eleanor watched him work, noting the calluses on his hands, the quiet competence in his movements. He did not strike her as a man who left everything to servants, and that surprised her more than she wanted to admit. "You handle him well," she said. "I expected someone in your position to leave such matters to a stable hand. I was raised believing a man should know how to care for what belongs to him," Adrian said, not looking up from the wound. "My father held to old ideas. Not all of them were wrong." "Was," Eleanor repeated softly, catching the word. Adrian's hands stilled for a moment before he continued his work. "He passed some years ago," he said. "The title came to me sooner than I wished for it." Eleanor thought of her own father, of the debts and the silence he had left behind, and felt an unexpected kinship settle between them, strange and unbidden. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "As am I, for your losses," Adrian replied, and something in the way he said it told her he had learned more about her circumstances than she had shared. She wondered, briefly, how much the village gossips had told him, and felt a flicker of discomfort at being so easily known by a man she barely understood. They spoke for a while longer, about the horse, about the weather, about nothing of consequence, and yet Eleanor found herself reluctant for the conversation to end. There was something unguarded about him in these quiet moments, something at odds with the cold reputation that preceded him through every village within a day's ride. She wondered which version of him was true, or whether both were, layered over each other like coats against the cold. Before he left that second day, Adrian insisted on repaying her for her trouble, an offer she refused twice before he pressed a small purse of coin into her hand regardless, closing her fingers around it with a firmness that left no room for argument. She wanted to refuse a third time, pride bristling at the thought of accepting charity from a stranger, however kind his manner. But she thought of her mother's medicine, dwindling faster than their coin could replace it, and swallowed her protest. "Consider it payment for services rendered," Adrian said, reading the conflict on her face with unsettling accuracy. "Not charity. You saved a valuable animal from a wound that might have ended far worse. I would have paid any stable hand the same for such work." It was a generous fiction, and they both knew it, but Eleanor accepted it gratefully, allowing him the kindness of pretending it was simply business between them. He returned again 3 days later, this time with a proper excuse, claiming he wished to see how the gelding's leg had healed, though the animal had already been returned to his own stables the day before. Eleanor did not point out the inconsistency. She found she did not want to. That visit stretched into a walk along the fence line, where he insisted on repairing the broken rails himself rather than sending workmen, and Eleanor found herself laughing, actually laughing, at his clumsy attempts with the hammer, a sound she realized she had not made freely in longer than she cared to admit. "You are terrible at this," she said, watching him bend a nail hopelessly out of shape. "I am a duke," he replied, mock-affronted. "Precision labor was never part of my education." "Clearly not," she said, taking the hammer from him with a smile she could not suppress. "Watch and learn, Your Grace." He watched her work with an intensity that made her hands unsteady, though she managed to drive the nail true regardless, and when she glanced up to find him staring, not at her work but at her face, Something passed between them that neither acknowledged aloud. As the days passed, their meetings grew less accidental and more deliberate, though neither spoke openly of what drew them together. Adrian would arrive under some minor pretext, a question about the horse, an offer of assistance with some small repair around her cottage, and Eleanor found herself watching for him despite every instinct warning her against it. She knew the dangers of what was forming between them, a duke and a woman of no fortune, no connections, nothing to offer but her own hands and her own mind, made for a story that ended poorly more often than not. She had heard enough tales, whispered over washing lines and market stalls, of women ruined by hopes raised too high by men who never intended to follow through on the promise of their attention. She told herself she would guard against such foolishness, that she understood exactly what she was to a man like him, a passing curiosity, nothing more. And yet, when Adrian arrived one afternoon looking uncharacteristically weary, his usual composure frayed at the edges, she found herself abandoning caution entirely, ushering him inside without a second thought, and setting a kettle to boil. "You look as though the world has been sitting on your shoulders," she said, watching him settle into the chair across from her small table, his large frame looking almost out of place in her modest cottage. "It has, rather," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "There are expectations placed upon a man in my position that have little to do with what he wants, and everything to do with what his family requires." Eleanor poured the tea and set it before him, saying nothing, sensing he needed the space to speak without pressure. It took him a long moment, but eventually the words came, halting at first, then steadier. "My family expects me to marry," he said, "soon. There is a woman, chosen for her connections and her fortune, both of which would benefit the estate considerably. My aunt has been arranging the match for months, and I have run out of reasonable excuses to delay it further." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach at his words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "And do you love her?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Adrian's gray eyes lifted to hers, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I barely know her," he said quietly. "It was never meant to be about love. It was meant to be about duty." "And is that enough for you?" Eleanor asked, her voice softer now. He did not answer right away, and the silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither was prepared to say aloud. "It was, once," he said finally, "before a stray horse led me to this cottage." Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it, and she looked away, unable to hold his gaze under the weight of what he had just admitted. She understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that whatever was growing between them was no longer a small, contained thing that could be dismissed as passing curiosity. It had roots now, and roots were far harder to pull free without damage. "You should not say such things to me," she said quietly, though she made no move to put distance between them. "Why not?" Adrian asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because it is inconvenient? Because the world would call it foolish? Because it will only lead to pain," Eleanor said, forcing herself to meet his eyes despite the ache building behind her ribs. "For both of us, but especially for me. You have a family, a title, a fortune to protect. I have nothing to offer against any of that. You have offered more in these past weeks than anyone has in years," Adrian said, his voice low and certain. "Kindness without calculation. Honesty without flattery. I did not know how much I had missed such things until I found them here." Eleanor did not know what to say to that, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the small cottage filled only with the sound of the fire crackling and the wind pressing gently against the windows. She wanted, desperately, to believe in the sincerity of his words, to let herself hope for something she had long ago convinced herself was not meant for someone like her. But hope, she knew from bitter experience, could be a dangerous thing to indulge, especially when it came wrapped in a title she could never hope to match. "You should go," she said finally, though the words cost her more than she wanted to admit, "before either of us says something we cannot take back." Adrian studied her for a long moment, and she thought he might argue, might press the matter further, but instead he rose slowly, gathering his coat, his expression unreadable. At the door he paused, glancing back at her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "I do not intend to stay away, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Whatever you decide to call this between us, I do not intend to pretend it does not exist." He left before she could respond, and Eleanor stood alone in her small cottage, long after the sound of his horse had faded into the distance, her heart torn between the practical wisdom that told her to guard herself carefully, and the reckless hope that had begun, despite every warning, to take root. A letter arrived 2 days later, sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. requesting her presence at Ashcombe Hall to check on the gelding's continued recovery. Eleanor read the formal words twice, searching for Adrian's voice beneath the careful language, and found it in the small, unnecessary detail included at the close, a note that the horse had been asking for her, as though an animal could summon a person by name. She smiled despite herself, and spent longer than she cared to admit deciding what to wear for a visit that was, officially, nothing more than a matter of animal husbandry. The carriage sent to collect her was finer than anything she had ridden in since her father's death, and Eleanor sat stiffly on its cushioned seat, watching the countryside roll past, her nerves tightening with every mile that brought her closer to Ashcombe Hall. When the estate finally came into view, rising from the surrounding parkland like something carved from old stone and older money, she understood at once the full weight of the distance between her world and his. The hall itself seemed to swallow the sky, its windows catching the afternoon light in rows too numerous to count, its grounds stretching in every direction with the kind of careful, cultivated beauty that spoke of generations of wealth. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, feeling suddenly and acutely aware of her plain traveling dress, mended twice at the hem, and the roughness of hands unused to idleness. A servant led her through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with silent judgment. She was shown eventually to the stables, where she found the gelding in far finer accommodations than her own small structure could offer, and Adrian waiting beside it, his expression brightening the moment he saw her. "You came," he said, as though there had been genuine doubt. "You asked," Eleanor replied, though her voice betrayed more warmth than she intended. They spent a pleasant hour examining the horse together, though the animal required little attention now, its wound nearly healed beneath careful care. Eleanor understood, as did Adrian, that the visit had never truly been about the horse at all, and when he offered to show her the grounds, she accepted without hesitation, curiosity overtaking whatever caution remained. The garden stretched far beyond anything Eleanor had imagined, hedges trimmed into careful shapes, fountains catching the light, pathways winding between flowering trees that filled the air with sweetness. Adrian walked beside her, pointing out small details, a bench his mother had favored, a tree he had climbed as a boy despite his father's disapproval, and Eleanor found herself glimpsing, piece by piece, the man beneath the title, someone shaped by loss and duty, and a loneliness he rarely allowed himself to voice. "It is beautiful here," she said, as they paused beside a fountain, water catching the afternoon sun, in bright scattering drops. "But it feels quiet, somehow, empty." Adrian glanced at her, surprised by the observation. "It has felt that way for a long time," he admitted, "since my parents passed, and my sister married and moved north. The halls have felt larger than they should. I fill them with obligations instead of people. Meetings, correspondence, matters of the estate. It keeps the silence from pressing too closely." "That sounds lonely," Eleanor said softly. "It is," Adrian admitted, and something in the honesty of the admission settled between them like a shared secret. They did not notice the figure watching from an upstairs window until they turned back toward the hall, and even then, Eleanor caught only a brief impression, a woman's silhouette withdrawing quickly from view, before Adrian's attention pulled her toward lighter conversation. The woman, Eleanor would learn before the day ended, was Lucinda Grave, a distant cousin of Adrian's who had taken up residence at Ashcombe Hall following the death of her own husband some years prior. She joined them for tea in a sitting room decorated with the same careful opulence as the rest of the house, her smile polished and pleasant, though her eyes, Eleanor noticed, held something sharper beneath the surface warmth. "Miss Hartley," Lucinda said, her voice smooth as silk. "Adrian has told me so little about you. How did you two come to be acquainted?" "Her family's land borders the eastern fence," Adrian said easily, before Eleanor could answer. "She found my gelding after the storm and tended his injuries herself." "How resourceful," Lucinda said, her smile never wavering, though Eleanor caught the faint edge beneath the compliment, the careful measuring of her clothing, her manner, her worth. "It is rare to find such competence outside of proper training. Where did you learn such skills, Miss Hartley?" "Necessity taught me," Eleanor said plainly, refusing to be diminished by the question's implication. "One learns quickly when there is no one else to rely upon." Lucinda's eyes flickered with something Eleanor could not quite name, though she suspected it was not admiration. The conversation continued for another quarter hour, polite on the surface, though Eleanor felt the careful undercurrent of assessment running beneath every question Lucinda posed, and left the visit with the distinct impression that she had made an enemy without quite understanding how. Adrian walked her to the carriage himself, his hand lingering at her elbow longer than propriety strictly allowed, and Eleanor found herself reluctant to leave, the pull of him settling deeper into her chest with every visit. "Your cousin does not care for me," she said quietly, as they reached the carriage. "Lucinda cares for very little beyond her own interests," Adrian replied, though his expression tightened slightly. "Do not concern yourself with her opinion." But Eleanor did concern herself, more than she wanted to admit, and her instincts proved correct within the week. She learned of it first through Peter, who arrived breathless at her door one afternoon with news that whispers had begun circulating through the nearby villages, tales of a common woman scheming her way into a duke's affections, using injured horses and manufactured kindness to climb far above her proper station. The details were twisted just enough to sting, embellished with cruelty that could only have come from someone who knew the true story and had chosen to poison it deliberately. Eleanor's stomach turned cold as she listened, understanding at once where such rumors had originated. Lucinda Grave, it seemed, had no intention of allowing an unsuitable woman to threaten whatever plans she held for Adrian's future, whether those plans involved her own ambitions or those of the family she claimed to protect. Eleanor said nothing to Adrian at first, uncertain how to raise the matter without appearing to seek his defense, uncertain too whether such rumors would matter to a man of his position at all. She continued her days as before, tending her mother, managing her small household, though the whispered glances from villagers who once greeted her warmly now carried a different weight, curious and cold in equal measure. It was her mother who finally noticed the change in her, some days later, watching Eleanor stare unseeing at her mending, her needle still in her hand. "Something troubles you," her mother said gently. "You have been distant these past days." Eleanor set down her mending and told her mother everything then, the horse, the visits, the growing feelings she had tried and failed to suppress, and finally, the rumors now spreading through the village like poison through water. Her mother listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. "Do you love him?" her mother asked, when Eleanor finished. The question startled her, direct in a way she had not expected. "I do not know," Eleanor said honestly. "I know that I think of him more than I should. I know that when he is near, the world feels less heavy than it has in years. But I know, too, what such feelings cost a woman in my position, should they prove foolish." Her mother reached over and took her hand, her grip weaker than it once had been but no less certain. "Your father chose me over a woman of considerable fortune once," she said quietly. "His family disapproved for years, but he never once regretted the choice, not in all our years together, even through the hardship that followed. Love built on honesty is rarely foolish, Eleanor, whatever the world chooses to call it." Eleanor held on to her mother's words in the days that followed, though the rumors continued to spread, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until even the shopkeeper in the village greeted her with a coolness that stung more than she wanted to admit. She began to dread the walk to market, the whispered conversations that fell silent as she passed, the sidelong glances that followed her down familiar streets that had once felt like home. Through it all, Adrian remained unaware, his visits continuing with the same warmth and eagerness as before, and Eleanor found herself reluctant to burden him with troubles she was not certain he could solve, or would even wish to. She told herself she would manage the rumors on her own, that they would fade in time as village gossip so often did, and that the growing bond between herself and Adrian was worth whatever temporary discomfort the whispers caused. She did not yet understand how carefully Lucinda intended to ensure the rumors did not fade at all, but grew instead into something far harder to escape. Adrian arrived at her cottage one evening carrying a small wrapped parcel, his expression carrying a shy uncertainty that seemed strangely out of place on a man so accustomed to command. Inside, Eleanor found a book of poetry, its pages soft with age, its margins filled with careful handwriting she recognized after a moment as belonging to Adrian himself. "It was my mother's," he explained, watching her reaction closely. "She used to read to me from it when I was small. I thought you might enjoy it more than it deserves to sit unused in my study." Eleanor traced her fingers over the worn leather cover, moved by the gesture in a way she had not expected. "This is too precious a thing to give away," she said softly. "Then do not think of it as given," Adrian said. "Think of it as shared." They sat together that evening, reading passages aloud by firelight, Eleanor's mother dozing gently in her chair nearby, and for a few stolen hours, the weight of rumors and reputation, and everything standing between them, seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future she had long ago convinced herself was impossible, one where a man like Adrian Whitmore might choose a woman like her, not out of pity or fleeting curiosity, but out of genuine, lasting regard. It was during a pause in their reading that Adrian finally spoke of the marriage arrangement pressing upon him, his voice quieter than usual, careful in a way that told her the matter weighed heavily. "My aunt has set a date," he said. "For the formal announcement, she grows impatient with my delays, and the family council has begun to voice concerns about the estate's future without an heir secured." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, despite the warmth of the fire. "When?" she asked. "3 weeks," Adrian said, "unless I find a way to refuse the match entirely, which grows more difficult with each passing day." "Do you intend to refuse it?" Eleanor asked, though she was not certain she wanted to hear the answer. Adrian set down the book of poetry and turned to face her fully, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I intend to choose a life I can live honestly," he said, "whatever cost that carries. I have spent my entire existence fulfilling obligations chosen for me by others. I find I no longer wish to continue that pattern, not when something far more meaningful has shown me what honesty actually feels like." Eleanor understood, without needing further explanation, exactly what he meant, and the weight of his words settled over her like both a promise and a burden. She wanted desperately to believe he could simply choose her. That title and fortune and family expectation could be set aside as easily as he suggested. But she had lived long enough in the world to understand how rarely such choices came without cost, and how often that cost fell hardest on those with the least power to bear it. "Your family will not accept me," she said quietly. "You know this as well as I do. My family has accepted far less deserving choices throughout its history," Adrian said, a trace of bitterness entering his voice. "Fortunes married for convenience, alliances built on nothing but political advantage. I would rather build something honest, even if it costs me their approval, than spend a lifetime bound to comfortable dishonesty." Eleanor wanted to believe him entirely, and in that firelit moment, surrounded by poetry and quiet warmth, she nearly did. But a small, cautious part of her mind, the part shaped by years of hardship and disappointment, held back, wary of hope built too quickly on words alone. The rumors, meanwhile, grew worse. What had begun as whispered gossip in the village market had spread, within days, to more dangerous ground. Eleanor learned from a tearful visit by a family friend that letters had begun circulating among the county's finer families, anonymous but carefully detailed, painting her as a calculating woman who had staged the entire incident with the horse, who had deliberately damaged the fence to lure the Duke's prized animal onto her property, all in service of a scheme to trap a wealthy man into an unsuitable match. The cruelty of the accusation stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs. She had done nothing but show kindness to an injured creature, and now that kindness had been twisted into something calculated and shameful, spread by careful hands determined to see her ruined before her connection to Adrian could grow any deeper. She confronted the truth of the situation with a heavy heart, understanding at last that she could no longer keep the matter from Adrian, whatever discomfort the conversation might cause. She sent word requesting his presence, and he arrived within hours, his expression darkening as she recounted everything, the whispers, the letters, the cold looks that now followed her through every public space she dared to enter. "Lucinda," Adrian said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, once Eleanor finished. "This bears her particular cruelty." "I have no proof," Eleanor said, "only suspicion." "You need no proof for me to recognize her hand in this," Adrian said grimly. "She has resented my independence for years, ever since I refused to be guided entirely by her counsel following my father's death. A match with a fortune of her choosing would secure her own position within the family. Your presence threatens that far more than she will ever openly admit." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will speak with her," Adrian said. "And I will make certain the rumors cease, whatever it costs to silence them." But Eleanor understood, even as he made the promise, that some rumors, once released into the world, could not simply be called back by demand, however powerful the man attempting to silence them. Reputation, once tarnished, rarely returned to its original shine, no matter how false the accusations proved to be. And she feared, with growing certainty, that the coming weeks would test whatever bond had formed between them, far more severely than either of them yet understood. That night, after Adrian departed with a promise to confront his cousin directly, Eleanor sat alone by the dying fire, the book of poetry still open in her lap, and allowed herself, for the first time, to feel the full weight of fear pressing against her chest. She feared not for herself alone, though the damage to her reputation threatened everything she had worked to build for her small family. She feared, more deeply, For what might happen to whatever fragile thing had grown between herself and Adrian, should the pressure of his world prove too heavy for either of them to withstand. Her mother, watching from her chair, spoke softly into the quiet room. "Whatever comes, Eleanor," she said, "know that you have done nothing to be ashamed of. Let those who spread lies carry the shame instead. It was never yours to bear." Eleanor held on to those words in the days that followed, though the whispers continued, and the coldness in the village deepened, and the date of the formal announcement Adrian had spoken of drew ever closer, carrying with it the promise of a confrontation neither of them could avoid much longer. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, addressed in careful, elegant script and sealed with the same crest that had marked Adrian's very first letter. Lucinda Grave had organized a gathering at Ashcombe Hall, ostensibly to celebrate the harvest season, though Eleanor understood, the moment she read the guest list included every prominent family within 3 counties, that the true purpose ran far deeper than seasonal celebration. Adrian himself delivered the invitation, his expression troubled despite his attempt to appear otherwise. "You do not have to attend," he said, watching her carefully as she read the elegant card. "I would understand entirely if you chose to stay away, given everything that has been said." "And if I stay away," Eleanor said slowly, "what will that silence say to everyone already whispering my guilt?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "It will say nothing you have not already earned through your own conduct, which has been beyond reproach from the beginning." "The world rarely concerns itself with earned reputation," Eleanor said, setting the invitation down with hands that trembled only slightly. "It concerns itself with appearances. If I hide now, every rumor spreading through this county will be taken as confirmed truth. I would rather face them directly, whatever it costs me, than spend the rest of my life shrinking from lies." Adrian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with clear worry in his gray eyes. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," he said quietly. "I only hope my family proves worthy of that courage." Eleanor did not share his hope, not entirely, though she kept her doubts carefully hidden as the day of the gathering approached. She spent what little coin remained after her mother's medicine on a modest but well-made dress, refusing to arrive looking as though she sought pity or apologized for her circumstances through her appearance. She would face the gathered families of the county as herself, without pretense, and let them judge her as they wished. The night of the gathering arrived clear and cold, stars scattered thick across a black sky, as Eleanor's borrowed carriage wound its way up the long drive toward Ashcombe Hall, every window blazing with candlelight, the sound of music and conversation spilling out into the crisp autumn air. Her heart pounded fiercely as she stepped down from the carriage, smoothing her skirts with hands that refused to steady, and walked toward the grand entrance with her chin held high despite every instinct urging her to turn back. The great hall, when she entered, seemed to still for the briefest moment, conversations pausing, heads turning with a curiosity that carried more coldness than warmth. Eleanor forced herself to move forward, searching the crowded room for a familiar face, and found Adrian near the far end of the hall, deep in conversation with an older woman whose sharp features and calculating gaze marked her immediately as his aunt. He caught sight of Eleanor and excused himself at once, crossing the room with a purposeful stride that drew even more attention than her arrival had, and Eleanor felt the weight of countless eyes following his path toward her, whispers rising in his wake like smoke. "You came," he said softly, relief evident beneath his careful composure. "I told you I would," Eleanor replied, though her voice wavered slightly beneath the pressure of so many watchful stares. He offered his arm, and she took it, grateful for the steadiness it provided, as he led her through the crowded hall, introducing her where propriety demanded, his manner carefully warm despite the tension visible in the set of his shoulders. Most greeted her with polite, distant courtesy, the kind reserved for those tolerated rather than welcomed, though a few offered genuine warmth that Eleanor clung to gratefully amid the sea of careful coldness surrounding her. It was nearing midnight, the gathering at its fullest, when Lucinda made her move. She approached with a small cluster of admiring companions trailing in her wake, her smile as polished and pleasant as ever, though Eleanor caught the sharp glint of triumph hiding beneath the practiced warmth of her expression. "Miss Hartley," Lucinda said, her voice carrying just loudly enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "How wonderful that you found the courage to attend, given the circumstances." "Circumstances," Eleanor repeated evenly, refusing to let the barb land visibly. "I am not certain what circumstances you mean." "Come now," Lucinda said, her smile widening. "The whole county speaks of little else. A clever young woman, damaging a fence to lure a wealthy man's prized horse onto her property, nursing it back to health with such theatrical devotion that the poor man mistook calculation for genuine feeling, She paused, letting the accusation settle over the gathered crowd like a fresh wave of poison. Quite an impressive scheme, I must admit, though perhaps not entirely honest. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the surrounding guests, and Eleanor felt heat rise fiercely in her cheeks, humiliation and fury warring within her chest, as every eye in the hall turned toward her, waiting to see how she might respond to such a public, calculated accusation. "That is a lie," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt, though it carried clearly across the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby crowd. "I never damaged any fence. I found an injured animal, and did what any decent person would do." "Of course you would say as much," Lucinda replied smoothly, her expression carrying false sympathy that fooled no one paying close attention, though I imagine it becomes difficult to separate truth from convenient fiction, when so much stands to be gained through the telling. Eleanor felt her composure cracking beneath the weight of public humiliation, tears threatening despite her fierce determination not to let them fall in front of so many watching, judging faces. She searched desperately for something to say, some way to defend herself against accusations too vague and cruel to disprove directly, and found, in that terrible moment, that words entirely failed her. It was Adrian who finally spoke, stepping forward with an authority that silenced the murmuring crowd instantly. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting sharply through the tension filling the hall. "Miss Hartley has done nothing but show kindness to an injured creature, kindness I have witnessed myself, repeatedly, over these past weeks. These accusations are baseless and cruel, and I will not stand here and allow them to continue unchallenged." Lucinda's expression flickered, surprise and something colder passing briefly across her features before her composure returned. "I only speak what the county has already been saying, Adrian," she said, her voice carrying a warning edge beneath its sweetness. "Perhaps you should consider why so many have reached the same conclusion, rather than dismissing their concerns so readily." "The county says many things," Adrian replied coldly. "Not all of them true, and certainly not all of them kind." The exchange left the hall in stunned silence, and Eleanor, standing at the center of it all, felt the full weight of every watching eye pressing down upon her, judgment and curiosity mingling in expressions she could not fully read. She looked to Adrian, desperate for some sign of reassurance, and found him locked in a tense standoff with his aunt, who had appeared at Lucinda's side sometime during the confrontation, her expression carrying a warning far more dangerous than anything Lucinda herself had voiced. "Adrian," his aunt said quietly, though her voice carried clearly in the hushed room. "A word, if you please, privately." Adrian hesitated, glancing back at Eleanor with clear reluctance, and in that hesitation, Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack painfully. She understood, watching the conflict play across his features, that duty and family expectation still held a claim over him that her own presence could not easily overcome, whatever tender words had passed between them in quieter, private moments. "Go," Eleanor said softly, though the word cost her dearly. "And your family is waiting." Adrian's expression twisted with something like anguish, but he followed his aunt from the hall regardless, leaving Eleanor standing alone amid a crowd of curious, judging strangers, humiliation burning fresh and raw beneath her carefully maintained composure. She did not wait to learn what passed between Adrian and his aunt in whatever private room they retreated to. She gathered what remained of her dignity, offered a brief, cold nod to Lucinda's triumphant expression, and made her way toward the entrance, ignoring the whispers that followed every step of her departure. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of unshed tears finally allowed to fall, Eleanor's chest aching with a grief she had not expected to feel so sharply. She had known, from the very beginning, the risks of allowing herself to hope for something as impossible as a duke's genuine affection. She had told herself repeatedly that she understood the distance between their worlds, that she would guard her heart carefully against exactly this kind of pain, and yet, watching Adrian hesitate, watching duty pull him away from her side in the moment she needed him most, the pain proved far sharper than any careful preparation could have softened. By the time she reached her cottage, exhaustion and heartbreak had settled into something colder and more resolved. She understood, with painful clarity, that whatever had grown between herself and Adrian Whitmore could not survive the weight of his world, however genuine his feelings might have been. She resolved, standing alone in her quiet kitchen long after midnight had passed, that she would not allow herself to be drawn back into false hope again, regardless of whatever apologies or explanations might follow. She did not yet know that Adrian, in the private room where his aunt had led him, was fighting a battle of his own, one that would determine far more than either of them yet understood. His aunt had wasted no time once the study door closed behind them, her composure dropping away to reveal a frustration that had clearly simmered for weeks. "You cannot continue this, Adrian," she said sharply. "A woman with no fortune, no connections, dragged through public scandal already, however unfairly. The family cannot afford the damage to its standing, not with the marriage negotiations already so far advanced." "The negotiations can be ended," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the anger building beneath his calm exterior. "I never gave my full consent to them in the first place. You arranged the match believing I would eventually yield to expectation, as I always have. And why should this time prove different?" his aunt demanded. "Because of a woman you have known a matter of weeks?" "Because for the first time in years, I have found something honest," Adrian said. "I will not sacrifice that for the comfort of appearances, whatever the cost to family expectation." His aunt studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, frustration giving way, slowly, to something closer to reluctant understanding. "Your father would have said the same once," she admitted quietly, "before duty wore him down to something more practical. I had hoped to spare you that particular disappointment." "Then trust me to make my own choice," Adrian said, "rather than spare me from feeling anything at all." The conversation stretched on for another hour, difficult and honest in ways their family had rarely allowed itself to be, and by its end, Adrian understood that whatever support he received from his family would come slowly, if it came at all. But he understood, too, with a clarity that settled deep into his chest, that he was no longer willing to trade that support for a life built on obligation rather than genuine feeling. He returned to the main hall to find Eleanor already gone, and the realization struck him with far more force than he expected, a sharp, sudden fear that he had already lost something precious through his own hesitation. He searched the departing crowd briefly, hoping against reason that she had simply stepped outside for air, but found no sign of her among the guests still lingering in the entrance hall. It was Lucinda who informed him, with poorly disguised satisfaction, that Eleanor had left more than an hour prior, her expression carrying no room for misinterpretation. Adrian felt something cold and desperate settle into his chest at the news, understanding at once the depth of the wound his hesitation had caused. He did not sleep that night, pacing the length of his study long past the hour when the last guests finally departed, replaying the moment of his hesitation over and over, understanding with painful clarity how it must have appeared to Eleanor, watching him follow his aunt from the room rather than standing firmly at her side when she needed him most. By morning, he had reached a decision that required no further deliberation. He summoned Lucinda to his study at first light, and the confrontation that followed carried none of the polished courtesy she had shown throughout the previous evening's gathering. Adrian laid out, plainly and without room for denial, the evidence he had quietly gathered over the preceding days, evidence pointing directly to her hand in spreading the cruel rumors that had so thoroughly damaged Eleanor's reputation throughout the county. "I have letters," he said coldly, "matching your handwriting, sent to 3 separate families with details only someone close to this household could have known. I have a servant willing to testify that you instructed the fabrication of the fence story specifically, knowing it to be false." Lucinda's careful composure finally cracked, indignation and fear mixing in her expression as she attempted, briefly, to deny the accusation, before recognizing the futility of continued pretense. "I did what was necessary," she said instead, her voice sharp with defensiveness, "to protect this family's standing from a match that would have brought nothing but scandal." "You protected nothing but your own position within this household," Adrian replied, "and you very nearly cost me the one honest thing I have found in years. I want you gone from Ashcombe Hall by week's end. Whatever allowance my father once arranged for you will continue, but you will no longer reside under this roof, nor will you involve yourself further in matters concerning my personal life." Lucinda left the study in stunned, furious silence, and Adrian felt no satisfaction in the confrontation, only a grim relief that the source of Eleanor's suffering had finally been exposed and removed from any further capacity to cause harm. His next task proved far more difficult than confronting his cousin. He needed to find a way to prove to Eleanor, beyond simple words, that his feelings ran deeper than momentary hesitation, that whatever fear had gripped him in that crowded hall would not define the choice he intended to make now. He rode out from Ashcombe Hall as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the same golden light that had marked their very first meeting weeks before, now stretching long shadows across the familiar road toward Eleanor's cottage. His heart pounded with a nervousness he had not felt since he was a boy, uncertain whether words alone could repair the damage his hesitation had caused, uncertain whether Eleanor would even agree to see him after the humiliation she had endured on his family's behalf. He found her in the small garden behind her cottage, tending the last of the season's herbs with careful, methodical movements, her expression carrying a weariness that struck him deeply as he dismounted and approached. "Eleanor," he said softly, and she looked up, surprise flickering across her features before settling into something more guarded. "You should not have come," she said, though her voice lacked the sharpness the words might have carried. "I could not stay away," Adrian replied. "Not after last night. Not after understanding how badly I failed you when you needed me most." Eleanor set down her gardening tools, straightening slowly, her expression carefully neutral despite the visible effort it clearly cost her. "You followed your family, as duty required," she said. "I understand the weight of such obligations, Adrian. I do not fault you entirely for honoring them." "I fault myself," Adrian said, closing the distance between them. "I should never have hesitated, not for a single moment. You stood alone before that entire crowd, humiliated by lies my own cousin manufactured, and I chose that exact moment to follow duty, instead of standing firmly at your side. That failure will haunt me far longer than you might imagine." Eleanor's composure wavered slightly at the raw honesty in his voice, though she held her ground, unwilling to allow hope to overtake caution so easily after the pain of the previous evening. "And what has changed since then?" she asked. "Beyond an apology, however sincerely meant?" "Everything," Adrian said firmly. "I confronted Lucinda this morning. She has confessed to spreading every rumor that has damaged your reputation these past weeks, and she has been removed from Ashcombe Hall entirely, effective immediately. I have also ended the marriage negotiations my aunt arranged, formally and without room for further discussion. Whatever cost that carries to family expectation, I am prepared to bear it." Eleanor stared at him, searching his expression for any hint of exaggeration or false promise, and found only steady, unwavering sincerity in the gray eyes that held her gaze without flinching. "You ended the negotiations," she repeated slowly, as though needing to hear the words again to fully believe them. "I told you once that I intended to build an honest life, whatever it cost me," Adrian said. "I meant it then, and I mean it far more deeply now, having nearly lost the one thing that made such honesty possible in the first place." Eleanor felt tears building behind her eyes, though these carried none of the bitter grief of the previous night's carriage ride home. "The county will speak of this for months," she said softly. A duke setting aside an advantageous match for a woman with nothing to offer but her own hands and her own honesty. "Let them speak," Adrian said, reaching for her hand with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I have spent my entire life measuring worth by fortune and connection, as my family taught me to. You have taught me, these past weeks, that far more valuable things exist in the world, things no inheritance could ever purchase." Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to believe him fully, the last of her careful guard falling away beneath the weight of his sincerity. "I was so certain last night that this was over," she admitted quietly, "that whatever had grown between us could not survive the world you belong to." "It very nearly did not," Adrian admitted, "but I refuse to let it end that way, not when I have finally found something worth fighting to keep." He drew her hand to his lips then, a gesture far more intimate than anything propriety strictly allowed between them, and Eleanor did not pull away, understanding, with a certainty that settled warmly into her chest, that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would not face them alone. They stood together in the fading golden light of her small garden, the same light that had marked the beginning of everything between them weeks before, and Eleanor felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the future stretching ahead of her might hold more promise than fear. Word of the broken engagement and the scandal surrounding Lucinda's departure spread through the county within days, carrying with it, to Eleanor's quiet relief, a slow but steady correction of the rumors that had so thoroughly damaged her reputation. Those who had once regarded her with cold suspicion began, gradually, to offer more genuine warmth, understanding at last the truth behind the lies that had painted her so unfairly. Adrian's aunt, though never fully reconciled to her nephew's choice, gradually softened her opposition as the weeks passed, observing the genuine happiness that had settled over her nephew, a contentment she had not witnessed in him since long before his father's passing. Family expectation, Eleanor learned, could bend when faced with undeniable evidence of genuine devotion, however slowly and reluctantly that bending occurred. Eleanor's own mother, watching her daughter's transformation with quiet satisfaction, offered no words of triumph over having predicted such an outcome, though her knowing smile carried its own quiet vindication each time Adrian visited their modest cottage, no longer bothering with excuses about horses or fences, arriving simply because he wished to be near the woman who had changed the course of his carefully guarded life. Winter settled over the county in the months that followed. blanketing the fields in white and quieting the roads that connected Eleanor's small cottage to the grand halls of Ashcombe Hall, though the distance between them, once so vast and impossible, now seemed to shrink with every passing week. Adrian visited as often as propriety and his duties allowed, sometimes bringing small gifts, more often bringing simply himself, content to sit by her fire discussing books, or estate matters, or nothing of consequence at all, savoring the ease that had grown so naturally between them. Eleanor's reputation, once so cruelly damaged, had by midwinter fully recovered, aided in no small part by the quiet efforts of families who had witnessed Lucinda's public humiliation, and understood, at last, the truth behind the rumors she had so carefully constructed. Even the village shopkeeper, who had once greeted Eleanor with cold suspicion, now offered warm greetings each time she visited, small kindnesses that meant more to her than she cared to admit after the isolation of the previous autumn. It was on a cold, clear evening in early winter, snow falling softly outside the cottage windows, that Adrian arrived unannounced, his expression carrying a nervous energy Eleanor had not seen in him before, not even during the tensest moments of their earlier troubles. "You look as though you carry news," Eleanor said, setting aside the book she had been reading, watching him pace briefly near the fire before finally settling into stillness. "I carry a question," Adrian said, and something in his tone made Eleanor's heart begin to race. He crossed the small room to kneel before her chair, taking her hands gently in his own, and Eleanor felt the breath catch in her throat as understanding dawned. "Eleanor Hartley," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his gray eyes. "You found me at my most guarded, tending an injured creature with a kindness that asked for nothing in return. You showed me, through every difficulty that followed, what genuine honesty looks like, what courage looks like, what it means to face the world without pretense or calculation. I have spent months now certain of what I want, and I no longer wish to wait to make it known formally, before my family, before this county, before anyone who ever doubted the truth of what has grown between us. Will you marry me?" Eleanor felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, joy overwhelming every careful guard she had once maintained against exactly this kind of hope. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly with the weight of everything the word carried. "Yes, Adrian, I will." He rose then, drawing her into an embrace that held all the tenderness and relief of months spent fighting toward this single moment, and Eleanor, held securely against him, understood at last that the fear she had carried since that terrible night at Ashcombe Hall, the fear that his world would ultimately prove too heavy for whatever they had built together, had finally, fully, given way to certainty. Her mother, who had been quietly present in the next room throughout the entire exchange, entered with tears of her own, embracing her daughter warmly before offering Adrian a look of genuine, grateful approval that required no words to convey its full meaning. News of the engagement spread through the county with far different character than the cruel rumors of the previous autumn, carrying instead genuine warmth and, in many quarters, quiet admiration for a match built on such evident devotion rather than convenient calculation. Adrian's aunt, though her acceptance had come slowly and with considerable reluctance, arrived at the small cottage some days later to offer her formal congratulations, a gesture Eleanor recognized as significant given the woman's earlier opposition. "I confess I doubted this match entirely," his aunt admitted, studying Eleanor with an assessing gaze that had softened considerably since their first meeting. "But I have rarely seen my nephew carry himself with such genuine contentment. Whatever doubts I once held, I find myself setting them aside in favor of his evident happiness." Eleanor accepted the acknowledgement graciously, understanding that such acceptance, however delayed, mattered a great deal to Adrian, whose relationship with his remaining family had suffered strain enough throughout the difficult months of confrontation and change. The wedding took place in early spring, when the fields surrounding Ashcombe Hall had begun to bloom with the first stirrings of the new season, the same gardens where Adrian had once confessed the loneliness hiding beneath his carefully maintained composure, now filled with flowers and warmth, and the gathered well-wishes of a county that had, in the end, come to embrace the match wholeheartedly. Eleanor's mother, her health steadier now that proper care and comfort had become possible, stood proudly among the guests, her joy evident in every line of her weathered face. Eleanor walked through the gardens toward Adrian with a steadiness that surprised even herself, remembering with vivid clarity the frightened, uncertain woman who had first walked these same paths months before, acutely aware of every difference between her modest circumstances and the grandeur surrounding her. That uncertainty had given way, through months of genuine connection and hard-won trust, to a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with title or fortune, and everything to do with the knowledge that she had built something real, something that had survived cruelty and doubt and public humiliation, to emerge stronger for having endured them. Adrian watched her approach with an expression that held nothing back, no careful composure, no guarded distance, only open, evident joy that drew soft murmurs of approval from the assembled guests. When she reached him, he took her hands in his own, exactly as he had on the evening of his proposal, and Eleanor felt the same certainty settle over her now that she had felt then, a certainty that had only deepened with every month that passed between that moment and this one. The ceremony itself passed quickly, though Eleanor would remember every detail of it for the rest of her life. The words spoken, the warmth of Adrian's hands holding hers, the quiet pride in her mother's expression, the golden afternoon light falling softly across the gathered guests. When the moment finally came for Adrian to kiss her, sealing the promises they had made before the assembled county, Eleanor felt the last remnants of every doubt and fear that had once shadowed their connection fall away entirely, replaced by a joy so complete it left little room for anything else. The reception that followed carried on long into the evening, laughter and music filling the halls that had once felt so empty and quiet to Adrian, now brought fully to life by the presence of family and friends gathered to celebrate a match that had defied every expectation placed upon it. Eleanor moved through the celebration with an ease she could not have imagined possible months before, greeting guests who had once regarded her with suspicion, now offering genuine warmth in return, understanding at last that she belonged in this world not because of fortune or title, but because she had earned her place through honesty and courage that no amount of cruel rumor had managed to diminish. Late in the evening, as the celebration began to wind toward its close, Eleanor found herself standing once more beside the fountain in the garden where she and Adrian had first walked together, the water catching moonlight now instead of afternoon sun, the air carrying the sweet scent of spring blossoms rather than autumn's fading warmth. "Do you remember?" Adrian said, joining her beside the fountain, "standing here that first afternoon, telling me how empty this place felt?" "I remember," Eleanor said softly, leaning into the warmth of his presence beside her. "It does not feel empty any longer," Adrian said, and Eleanor smiled, understanding exactly what he meant, feeling the truth of it settle warmly into her own chest as well. She thought, standing there in the quiet spring evening, of the injured horse that had begun everything, of the frightened animal tangled in a broken fence that had led, through countless twists of fear and hope and cruelty and courage, to this exact moment, standing beside a man who had chosen honesty over convenience, love over duty, and had found, in that choice, a happiness far deeper than anything his title or fortune could ever have provided alone. The stray horse, now fully recovered and grown into one of the finest animals in Ashcombe Hall's stables, grazed peacefully in a nearby paddock, entirely unaware of the extraordinary chain of events its frightened flight through a storm had set into motion. Eleanor often visited it still, offering the same gentle care she had shown that very first morning, grateful, each time, for the small, unexpected mercy that had led a lost and injured creature directly to her door, and through it, to a life she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. As the last guests finally departed and the halls of Ashcombe Hall settled into peaceful quiet, Eleanor and Adrian remained together beneath the star-scattered sky, their future stretching ahead of them, uncertain in its particulars but certain in its foundation, built as it was on honesty freely given, and courage that had never once wavered, however difficult the path toward this moment had proven to be.